that you could even.
I'm delighted to see that we have such a good crowd here. I was nervous with Lehigh Lafayette weekend as ever go, where people's priorities are. Well, listen, let me first of all welcome you all to this, really the last lecture in this semester's series of talks and events. As you know, we had a wonderful gallery talk when the exhibition upstairs opened, the African Images of Obama. We had a happening. For those who missed that, you missed something truly strange and interesting. So, and then, of course, the lecture today, which is also very special. I'm Norma Girardot, and I'm one of the co-curators of the show upstairs, the African Images show. And my co-conspirator in these things, of course, is the head of the galleries here, Ricardo Vera. And Ricardo needs to tell you about some wonderful things coming up. Are actually going on right now. There are many galleries here.
The first thing I want to mention, happy to have you here, is we are having a sale starting today upstairs until December 22nd. Therefore, we got a very interesting, a lot of...
The first thing you tell them is about the sale.
Yes, it's about the sale, you know what I mean? No, because it's a good opportunity if you want. But the second thing, and most important, we have most of our exhibits will go on until December 9th. I like to remind you some of the exhibitions that we have. We have On Cage, which is an exhibit that we have right beside the Obama one. And it's a very interesting project. It's not only, you know, the visual aspect, but also we have, that is a sound exhibit. I don't know if you have noticed, but you will. We got different sounds from different places of this building. It's a very interesting thing. A la Cage, we are following that experimental idea of that. Across the street, we are having a very interesting exhibition from our large collection. We got a collection of 11,000 pieces. This is a Rauch business. We have Keith Haring posters. That is a very beautiful exhibit. You know, there are some original silkscreen posters, and it's a very beautiful exhibit right across. It's not that far. You can go there in a few seconds. The other exhibition that we have at McGuinness, which is the College of Art and Science, is Lehigh Valley Young Photography Invitational. We are right now in the middle of the whole month of November of Envision. That is a program of ArtQuest, and they engage about 40 different galleries in the area. We are also part of that. Also, we have a series of virtual videos right on the entrance of this gallery. Quite interesting. There are some 4 local artists, Lydia Panos, Daniel Paschal, Janice Lipton, and Vicky Da Silva. We have all the things going on. I just want to remind you that please go and see it. And don't forget the sale. Thank you.
So many wonderful things going on. And you know, Ricardo did not mention to you, and some of you may know, but for those that don't, next semester, of course, there will be a semester-long, very, very special show of Joe Mitchell, the extraordinary painter. But now, it's my pleasure to introduce someone truly special, Henry Glassie. And some of you, I think, probably know about him, and maybe some of you, perhaps quite a few of you, have read some of his many books, and I really mean many books. But let me just say a few words about him. First of all, he is currently Professor Emeritus at Indiana University, and actually has affiliations with 2 departments. Obviously, the folklore, what is it called? It's the folklore and ethnomusicology department. And also, he's a member of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. Some of you may know his work in terms of Turkish tradition, which is very distinguished. The thing to say here, and you know, this is one of these superlatives that academics throw around, but it is truly the case. Henry Glassie is truly one of the premier folklore scholars in the world. period. You know? And there are all sorts of different ways one can document that. But let me just say the following. First of all, he's a folklorist. And one is tempted to say that's a field that we desperately need more of these days. You know, folklorists are sprinkled around, but departments of folklore are still quite rare. Places like Indiana and actually University of Pennsylvania are some of the renowned departments in that area. And Henry Glassie has been affiliated with both of those very, very distinguished departments. And I must say, we need more folklorists these days. You know, in an age of globalism, which you might think is somehow the antithesis of being interested in folklore, it's not the case at all. You know, if anything, we've seen a new kind of particularism or tribalism or a recognition of the importance of tradition. And folklore is one of those disciplines that takes a hard look at that, and takes a hard look in a way that is very close to my heart from the standpoint of comparison. You know, there was a famous man, so-called father of comparative religions, Max Muller, who said, "He who knows one knows none." Now, that's a little glib, I'll admit, but there is some truth to that. Actually, some great truth to that. And Henry Glassie is really one of the great comparativists in terms of the work that he has done, because if you look at his work, first of all, it's prolific, but it's also exceedingly diverse in all sorts of interesting ways. Some of you I know are here because you know of his work in vernacular architecture, which in many ways is central to that whole discussion in terms of the significance of vernacular architecture, especially in this country, but in terms of world culture as well. Which allows me to get a very quick little plug. If you don't know about the Chinese pavilion, you should ask. It's not far away from here. And it's an interesting example of Chinese vernacular architecture. And I'm not going to rehearse all of the areas that Henry Glassie has worked in, but let me just mention a few. I mentioned vernacular architecture, of course, but in terms of world culture, Henry is someone who has, first of all, as I indicated before, done really important work in terms of Turkish tradition, Turkish art. And in addition to that, he has done 5 books on Irish tradition. Quite moving books. In fact, the most moving lecture I've ever heard in my life was down at Material Culture a couple of years ago when Henry Glassie was giving a presentation on one of his Irish books, and it almost brought you to tears. And so he's done a lot on Irish tradition. He, in addition to that, has done recent work on Bangladesh. I think you've done some work now in Japan. And of course, one of his real interests, as you can see from what I've just said, is in reference to material culture, but especially material culture in a way that relates to expressive culture, art in particular. I've mentioned to you that he's prolific, and in terms of his writings, there are many, many, many books that he's written. Many of these books have won all kinds of awards. That brings me to the issue of awards. This man has won a lot of awards. I'm not going to read off a list to you. Let's simply say that at the age of 30, he won a Guggenheim and won many awards after that. Most recently, he won the American Council of Learned Societies Lifetime Achievement Award, which is called the Homer Haskins Award. And I must tell you, if you are intrigued at all in terms of what I'm telling you about Professor Glassie's background, I encourage you to go online and Google the Homer Haskins Prize, and you will get a copy of the lecture that he gave, where he talks about the meaning of scholarship and what he calls a life of learning, which becomes an artwork in its own right. The final thing to say here is that not only is Henry Glassie truly a distinguished and great scholar, and as I alluded to, he can be a mesmerizing lecturer, he writes beautifully. And if you haven't been exposed to his books, I encourage you to do so. They are really beautiful. They're works of art, they're works of scholarship. Professor Glassie is a real academic, but he has learned the very difficult art of not writing like an academic. And that's something I aspire to. So, it's hard, it's very hard to do that. So the point here is that we're truly delighted to have him here with us, and he's going to speak on obviously something that has been very close to his heart and mind from the very beginning of his career until today, the spirit of folk art. Henry Glassie.
Really, I don't know at all what to say after all of that. Norman was very sweet. Ricardo and Norman, I thank you both for having me here. But the lights are coming down a tiny bit prematurely because I think that, I like the lights down. I think you all ought to move over if at all possible, because honestly, if you don't hear what I say, I don't think it matters, but if you can't see the pictures, I think it does matter. So anybody that would like to scoot over, can you see all right? Okay, that's all. That's the lights back down. Wait. Now let's have it dark. Oh, wow. Very well. How many? Let's make it as dark as possible. We don't need notes. We do need pictures. Like I say, I'm a little bit flabbergasted by all of that praise from Norman. But delighted, I guess. What can I say? I'm delighted that you're all here, and let me tell you exactly what I'm up to. I begin with a picture of Barack Obama, painted by a street artist named Sergio in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil. It's a record, just like all the paintings above, of a particular moment in worldwide hope. I personally am relieved that that moment is not over.
Huzzah!
But that's up to you. I make no more editorial comment, but rather say, I start with a picture of our president, painted by an African American in Brazil, and therefore, at that point, I'm going to leave the topic of the exhibition because I don't know a thing about the paintings that are upstairs. They were collected by my dear friend George Abramovich. Many of you were here to listen to George talk about it. It would be ridiculous for me to make any comment about those pictures at all, other than to say that I'm touched by them, as perhaps you are. So why am I here? I'm here because those pictures implicitly raise the issue of folk art. Folk art being one of the terms that would be used to categorize the pictures that are above. And furthermore, folk art is the topic that I was invited to speak to you today about. So it may be that you wanted to hear more about the paintings upstairs, but I simply can't do that. Instead, my task is to talk to you about the idea of folk art. So I shall. Between 1870, when folk art was generally discovered in the world, and 1990, when the first phase of great interest in folk art ended, there were two different approaches to the idea of what folk art is. In one of them, the idea was to select examples of paintings and sculpture that could conceivably be called folk art in contradistinction to fine art. The selection of objects, of alternative objects that could be called folk art, led to a particular conclusion, which was the assembly of a large selection of objects that served the taste and needs of modernism. That is to say, the idea of folk art was, to a great extent, simply a part of the great modernist project. The second approach, we moved from an old santo that would bring a lot of money on the antique market to a santero with a saint in his hands, George Lopez, seen at the very end of his life in Cordova, New Mexico. The second great approach to folk art was not a matter of selecting excellent works that would fit with modernism. It was rather to leave the works of art in the hands of their creators, in the culture of their creators, in order to be able to understand the deep meanings of folk art. And that movement, too, led to certain conclusions. The first of those conclusions is this. I couldn't be more emphatic. There is no logical difference between folk art and fine art. Every time you try to define folk art in contradistinction to fine art, all the criteria that you use will simply ultimately fall apart. None of them work. The second thing that was learned in a long century of study is that not only that you couldn't really define folk art in contradistinction to fine art, but it was also that if you really wanted to understand folk art, you had to acknowledge the fact that every medium in the world had the potential for being art. That is, it wasn't just painting and it isn't just sculpture. Those are the particular media that have been favored in Western culture. But if you're going to look at the world and attempt to understand its folk art, you have to leave behind the reliance on the media of painting and sculpture and come into an understanding that every medium available to humankind has the potential in it for becoming art. So now in our day, this being at the end of that time, the end of that period, in our day, how could we, and this is the thing that I've really enjoyed putting together for you tonight, it's not an old lecture that I've retailed often, something that I constructed for this very occasion, and it excited me to think, now that we know that you can't really define folk art in contradistinction to fine art, and now that we know that every medium available to humankind is implicitly capable of being converted into art, not just representational media like painting and sculpture, but anything could become art. How do we go back to the democratizing project of folk art and make any sense of it? And here's the two moves that I would suggest. The first, you're looking at Yunseli Erdem, the village of Shinar Pinar in the high mountains of western Turkey. She's holding a rug that she's woven. She's the background for the foreground for this assertion. We need to start again, and instead of putting painting and sculpture at the center of our interest, we have to put ceramics and textiles at the center. Because painting and sculpture, while brought to great heights in the West, universally, textiles and ceramics are much more broad spread, much more deeply embedded media. That is, to evaluate the world's cultures. Norman was kind enough to talk about comparison as the normal mode of my procedure, and you'll find out very soon that that's exactly right. But to compare all the world's cultures on the basis of painting and sculpture does nothing but ultimately serve our needs of feeling superior about the rest of the world. And so I would say that we first of all need to decenter our vision and decenter our values by saying that how the world needs to be first discovered is through its ceramics and its textiles, because those are almost universal media, which painting and sculpture simply aren't. The second thing, as we move into the study of textiles and ceramics, the second thing we need to do is to search inside the objects that we're studying and with the people we're studying for what their values of creation are. So here's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to demonstrate the kind of work that I do by telling you a sequence of very brief stories drawn from my field research in the world of the hard-working potter. I'm sorry, just a little bit, oh, I got water here. Excuse me, I said that poorly. Let me try to be clear. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about potters. Here we go. I start far away, and I'm going to come nearer and nearer to where we are. At Pong, near Handan in northern China, fine ceramics have been made since the 15th century. There are in the city 10,000 potters. Most of them work in production, producing utilitarian ware that's necessary for the daily lives of other people in northern China. At the same time that there are 10,000 people who make utilitarian ware, there are a small group of people who consider themselves artists. There's my first point. That is, the difference between art and craft is not a difference between media, it's a difference within media. Within a particular medium, there will inevitably be a distinction that is the art-craft distinction. And so in the city of Pengcheng, there are 60 people who don't think of themselves as craftsmen, but who do think of themselves as artists. One of them is Mr. Liu, who's seen here with his 2 sons on the balcony of his apartment. All 3 of them are potters. And Mr. Liu is committed to a particular project. That project is the restoration of the excellence of the pottery made in Pengcheng by reference to the Shizu ware that was made in this region between 1300 and 1600. To that end, one of the things that he's done is he's gone around and found in museum collections and private collections everywhere he could go examples of Shizu ware, and he's made an intricate series of drawings that allow him to be able to understand more about the designs of the ancient ware that could be used in modern ware. He and his colleagues also collect shards. Near the sites of their kilns, whenever new pipes are laid, out of the ground come shards, and they use these shards to teach them, first of all, about design, and second of all, to gather from them slight hints about the nature of technique. Mr. Liu says that these shards are direct communications from the dead to the living. They're as clear as any text. All you have to do is to know how to read those texts. So Mr. Liu is at the center of a particular team. One of the members of his team is Mr. Ren, seen here with his son in front of his shop. Mr. Ren is the descendant of, he hasn't any idea how many generations of potters that have been working in Pengcheng. Probably 16, 17, 18 generations of potters. He's therefore an expert in technology, a recipient of the technical tradition, and he contributes to all of his friends who work among the artists in the circle of Mr. Liu. He contributes information about how pots are made and how they're best made. He said to me that what he was interested in doing was restoring the excellence of the work of his ancestors. Mr. An was trained in art school. Mrs. Sun was trained by Mr. Liu in his private educational studio. Here's Mr. Liu. He's leading a team. The team is dedicated to reviving quality by reference to late medieval pottery made in his place. His family was in the pottery trade, and he wanted to be a potter from the time he was a tiny child. But unfortunately, he grew up at exactly the time of the Cultural Revolution and was required by the government to be an electrician. It's not what he wanted to do, but it was what he was told would be useful to society. As soon as things began to loosen, Mr. Liu began to paint as a hobby, began to paint ceramics. And as they really grew loose, then he decided to learn everything that he possibly could about pottery and ultimately became the city's great teacher on the nature of the traditional ware from his place, Shizu ware. What happened? Oh well, something's wrong. There you go. I hate computers. I really hate computers. So I'm going to have to go back and have a picture of Mr. Liu. What the picture that's missing for some reason at that point was a picture of his works, but this is good enough. He's holding a pot that he made. Actually, his son threw it, but he painted it. What's important to Monsieur Liu. That is, remember what I'm after is, what are people's motives? What are the values that are driving them? The important thing for Mr. Liu is to go back to a time before the Cultural Revolution, to pick up an ancient variety of ceramics that was made in his locality, to use that ancient variety to repair the excellence, to restore the excellence of local production, but most of all, in his mind, to heal the violent rupture, a rupture that might be represented by a blank slide, of the Cultural Revolution. He suffered, his friends suffered, his traditions suffered, but now they can once again burst forth. So that's the end of the first story, and we hope the slides will continue to work. Who knows? In Pong, Chong, pottery has been made since the 15th century, and there are 10,000 potters. Exactly the same thing is true of Kutahya in the high mountains of western Turkey. Pottery has been made here, excellent pottery has been made here since the 15th century continuously without break, just as in Pong, Chong, and there are 10,000 potters. These potters all work in workshops. They call them ateliers, and these workshops are all directed by a master like Enver Ertan from Alhambra, Chini. And what he has is a team. His team consists of men like Bahattin Aydashgul, whose purpose is to make the forms, and women like Felice Kirk, who paints them. Under the master's direction, some make, some decorate, and what they create together is the normal wear. There's the average wear for the city of Kutahya. They don't think of it as art, but they think of it as having the potential to be lifted into art, and the person who does that lifting is a person called a designer. The greatest designer in the history of Kutahya is a man on the screen, Ahmet Shaheen. Ahmet Shaheen was tasked as the great designer to do two different things. One thing that he had to do was to make great works of art that would challenge and inspire the entire city. The second thing that he had to do was to make designs that could be used in all of the workshops. There's a supposition in Kutahya that not everybody is capable of original design. Not everybody is capable of grand and excellent manufacture, but everybody is capable of making something pretty good as long as they have the direction. The direction comes to them, or came to them, primarily from Ahmet Shaheen. To give some idea, there are 5 or 6 million pieces of pottery made every year in the city of Kutahya. About 30% were designed by Ahmet Shaheen. They've gone all over the world. Ahmet Shaheen was called by his friends in Kutahya the Son Usta, the ultimate master of the city of Kutahya. He was called this primarily because he was thought to be the best artist. That is to say, most people simply made pots that were useful. But Ahmet Shaheen made hakiki sanat, genuine art. He was also called the ultimate master because in 1927, he formed a partnership with a man called Hakichinigiolu. 1927. First World War is recently over. The Turkish War of Independence is recently over. The city has been devastated. It was right in the heart of both of those great wars. As a result, the pottery tradition in 1927 in the city of Kutahya was over. I've already told you there are 10,000 potters today. Ahmet Shaheen and Hakichinigiolu got together and they made a few very big pots. They're in the picture. Ahmet Shaheen is to the right, Haki Bey is to the left. They made a few big pieces and they put them in the window of a shop in downtown Kutahya. They waited a week and they put an advertisement in the newspaper saying that they were going to open a new atelier. That the great tradition of Kutahya Chini that goes all the way back to about 1450 couldn't conceivably be abandoned now. It had to be continued. Ahmet Bey told me that there was a line around the block when they opened the doors. At this point, the Chini, the pottery, the ceramics of Kutahya came back into life. It was Ahmet Shaheen with Hakichinigiolu that made that happen. What's important about the way they made it happen is that each of them brought into their collaboration a different skill. Ahmet Shaheen has, they say in the city, the perfect hand, the perfect painter's hand. At the same time, he has the perfect designer's mind. But Haken knew the technology. Both of them are absolutely necessary for ceramic art, and their collaboration made it such that the Chini tradition, the pottery tradition of Kutahya, continued. So here's Ahmet Shaheen, sitting between Ibrahim Erdayer and Mehmet Gürsoy. Just as Mr. Liu in Pong taught everybody around him so as to bring the pottery back to excellence, Ahmet Shaheen has done the same thing. He said to me he was willing to teach everybody who came to him, anybody who came to him. And in this case, he taught Ibrahim and Mehmet. Ahmet Shaheen died in 1996. Ibrahim and Mehmet continued. Both of them are now the masters of their own workshops. Ibrahim runs Süsler Chini, Mehmet runs İznik Chini. Both of them are prosperous and highly successful. Both of them are, in the words of Mehmet Gürsoy, the branches of the great plane tree that was Ahmet Shaheen. Ahmet Shaheen was, they say, Tekadam, the one person who kept it going in the hard times, and now it makes it possible for the next generation to continue excellently. What the next generation of artists does is bear down. You're looking over the shoulder of Kadriye Tosun, one of the fine young artists in Kutahya, and what she is doing is not only painting, she's leaving the world that you and I inhabit. She's exiting this environment for an entirely different place. She's following the road that they call the path of Ashk. Ashk is passion. It's the passion of lovers separated. It's the passion of the Sufi who's separated from God and pines for reunion, the reunion that comes with death. The person who is working towards Ash is a person who is trying to accomplish in this world an absolutely impossible task of perfection. But nonetheless, that is the goal. Through perfection, the artist gives herself into her work, and that work then stands before us as a guide to the understanding of what these people have as their values for creation. They shape into three semantic forms. You're looking at Kerim Keçicigil. He's holding a plate that they call yazılı, that is to say calligraphic. The calligraphic plate represents the Word of God. In this case, Kerim has made on the plate a prayer that was written by a great calligrapher, Hamid Aytaç, and he's offering it into the world as a representation of the Word of God, in the same way that somebody else would make a representation of an individual, representation of a landscape. He's made a representation of God's Word. That's one of the kinds of image made in the city of Kutahya today. The second is geometric. This is Nurten Shaheen, the wife of the grandson of the great Ahmet Shaheen, and she's just holding up in pride for you to see a geometric plate that she painted. The calligraphic plate represents the Word of God. The geometric plate represents the will of God. You can't make a picture of God's face in Islam because God has no body, no face. But you can represent the signs that God places upon the world, and what God primarily places upon the world is the order, the impeccable order of the whirl of the spheres that is exactly what is represented in geometric designs. You can look at an Islamic geometric design and think of it as an attractive background, an attractive ornament. But what it's about when you're in the Islamic world, what it's about is this is an image, this is as close as you could get to making an image of God. It's a picture of the will of God, of the way that God organizes the universe in this perfect, impeccable way that could be represented by human beings in terms of geometry, as in the hands of Nurten. The third of their characteristic types is chichekli, floral. Here, even more, you'd be tempted to think that what you're looking at is something that's decorative and pleasant. But it's not at all the way that the artist, Mehmet Gürsoy, understands it. He would say that the way for you to understand what you're looking at is to recognize that the flowers that he's painted on the plate are not real flowers. Since they're not real and they don't look real, what are they? They're symbols of the human soul. Those are not carnations. Those are not roses. Those are not tulips. Those are human souls. Those human souls flower out of a root at the bottom of the design, which is the will of God, and they flower into the impeccable circle of God's love. What the floral designs, that could be read by an outsider as merely decorative, what the floral designs mean to the people who actually paint them is that these are images of the way that society ought to exist harmoniously within the perfect circle of the love of the one God. The great inspiration for the potters of Kutahya, the immediate inspiration is the great man Ahmed Shaheen. The great inspiration ultimately is the Holy Quran. But artistically, the inspiration is the work of the 16th century. This is a tile from the front of the tomb of Suleiman the Magnificent. Turks call him the lawgiver, Kanuni. Exactly 1550 is the time that we're looking at. This was the pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire, the absolute apogee of the Ottoman Empire. And at that point, ceramic art had been lifted to a height that maybe it's never reached since. But at this great moment, there was a particular variety of floral design that the modern artist called Pottery that was made that represented the power of the great Ottoman state, and that kind of design now appears in a brand new plate by Ibrahim Erdair. Fantastic Hatay flowers. Not real flowers, I remind you, but symbols of souls. Symbols of souls that are blossoming into difference, because everybody's different. Some are men, some are women, some are tall, some are short, some are rich, some are poor, but all of us have flowered out of the will of God, and all of us exist in the perfect circle of God's love. But the way that that's done is through reference to a 16th century variety of design that flowered at the very pinnacle of Turkish power and Turkish artistic achievement. It's interesting that this kind of design in Turkey from 1550 parallels not aesthetically, but in concept, the contemporary work of Italians in the cities where Mayalak is produced. That is, they both go back, they both refer to, they both retrieve from exactly the same moment in the middle of the 16th century. The moment that was most powerful in Italy was also the moment that was most powerful in Turkey. So you've just looked at a brand new plate made by my friend Ibrahim Erdair in Kutahya, and here's a brand new plate made by Giulio Gianetti in the town of Deruta in Umbria, Italy. It represents, interestingly, Francesca, that you may recall as the beautiful woman out of the very top of Dante's Inferno. Deruta, we've been to Pong, we've been to Kutahya. Deruta also is a place where pottery has been continuously made since the 15th century. We've gone from China to Turkey, and now we're in Italy. We're heading home. We're heading to the west. Deruta is a characteristic hill town in Umbria, not far from Perugia. It's a place where there are today 72 distinct workshops. Just like Pong, just like Kutahya, we're not talking about a place where traditional pottery is dying out, but where it flourishes, where there are hundreds of workers making excellent things. And interestingly, the history of ceramic art in Deruta is exactly like the history of the ceramic art in Turkey, in Kutahya. In the Middle Ages, what was made was daily useful wear. But then, almost suddenly, between 1480 and 1570, that common ceramics was lifted up into a truly exalted art, an art of the highest quality. I say it somewhat challengingly because we're not used to it. We somehow think of ceramics inevitably as being craft, but the utilitarian ceramics could be called craft, but this is a moment, when a very brief moment, in fact, 1480 to 1570, when in both Turkey and in Italy, artisans, potters, took their old common ware and lifted it up into something magnificent. Then from 1570 to 1870, what happened both in Kutahya and in Deruta, where there were waves of success and failure. There were moments of decline and moments of revival, until in both cases in 1870, at that moment when folk art was discovered, it's amazing, all over the world. When folk art was discovered, all of a sudden it became interesting in both Kutahya and Deruta to go back to 16th century designs in order to recover a tradition. In exactly the same way that the potters of Pong, Chong are today rediscovering their early tradition. What happened was that people wanted to make something good, but they wanted to make something local. They didn't really want to copy things from outside. They wanted to go back into the depth of their own tradition and find really beautiful things. And it happens that both in Kutahya in Turkey and Deruta in Italy, they landed upon what had happened in the middle of the 16th century. Then, having landed on it, they began to work on that high Renaissance work. That is, the work that in Turkey was the period of the great Sinan and Sheh Hamdullah, the work that in Italy was from the period of Raphael and Michelangelo. The greatest, probably the greatest moment the world has ever known of art, and that art was self-consciously revived in both Deruta and Kutahya, beginning in the 1870s. And in both cases, once that revival began, once people were looking back to the high point of their own tradition, in both cases, by about 1910, a collaboration had come into the tradition, and that collaboration had produced a brand new excellence which still guides what's happening. In Deruta, the collaboration was between Alpinolo Magnini, who you see here, who was a man trained in art school, who was a man committed to aesthetic excellence, who was excited by pre-Raphaelite work in England, and who decided to turn back to the greatest guidance that he could find in Italian tradition, that is to say, the paintings from basically the period of Fra Filippo Lippi through Raphael. That was exhilarating to him, and he contributed to this collaboration the great knowledge that he had about Italian art from the High Renaissance. His collaborator was Ubaldo Grazia. Ubaldo was trained in his father's workshop. His father, Giuseppe, had been the latest of a long series of Grazias who had made pottery in the city of Deruta. But when Ubaldo Grazia, bringing his technical knowledge, and Alpinolo Magnini, bringing his artistic knowledge, made their collaboration, it was exactly like Ahmet Şahin and Hakichiniciolu in Kutahya. There's one person who contributed artistic knowledge, the other contributed technical knowledge, and together they were able to manage and create an amazingly robust revival that has not stopped to this day. So in the city of Deruta, there are two forces for order. One of them is a school named for the artist Alpinolo Magnini. The other is a workshop that was built in 1923 by Ubaldo Grazia. In Italy, just as in Turkey after the First World War, an exciting revival of energy. It's interesting, in exactly the same period. That is, the revival began in the 1870s when people discovered traditional art. After the First World War, the miseries were over, people began to be optimistic, and they returned again to their old traditions. And those two organizations, as the art school of Magnini and the workshop of Grazia, make the background for today's production, provide the infrastructure for people who are at work. Here's Chiara Bonini with her mother Graciela. Chiara was trained in the Magnini School. She entered her own family's workshop and improved her work. And what she does is to create, this is one of the options for production in contemporary Deruta, what she does is to make the kind of work that everybody else makes. That is, she continues the tradition by making particularly excellent versions of what is considered to be the normal wear of the town of Deruta. Just as there's a normal wear in Pong Chong and a normal wear in Kutahya, there's a normal wear in Deruta. It's the result of a long series of revivals. The first one, of course, is pretty obvious. That's the moment when Renaissance artists began to plunder around in the ruins of Nero's Golden House in Rome. They went down in the ground into what they thought were grottos, and they came up with designs which they called, because they were found in grottos, grotesque. The grotesques are generally called in Deruta Raphaelesques, because Raphael took those grotesque designs from ancient Rome and applied them in the loggia in the Vatican, and therefore they tend to name them after Raphael. But that's just the first, that is, the Italian revival of ancient Rome is the first in the series of revivals that is built into the construction of the contemporary work in the town of Deruta. Work like this quite lovely plate by Chiara Bonini. Gianni Marcucci does something different. He was trained in his own family's workshop, the Marcucci family workshop, and in that workshop what he's interested in doing is making perfect reproductions of historical wear. So this is Gianni's plate that was painted last winter in Deruta, and it's a faithful reproduction of a plate that was made by a man called Niccolo Francioli in 1525, and that's on display in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The great master of Deruta is exactly parallel to the great master of Kutahya. The great master of Kutahya is Ahmed Shaheen. The great master of Deruta is Antonio Margaritelli. Antonio was born in Deruta. He says he was born on the hill in 1937. When he was a little boy, he used to play around in the streets, and he was excited every time that there would be excavations. He would find the pot shards that were left over from the productions in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance in Deruta. He collected those pot shards, and at the age of 15, he went into the Grazia workshop. That is, when Ubaldo Grazia was still the master of the Grazia workshop, Antonio joined. There he was trained by a master called Virgilio Spaccini, and he worked at his side for many years, but eventually just became, as he said to me, absolutely sick of making the same Renaissance things over and over and over again. That is, he didn't want to do the kind of reproductions that Gianni Marcucci is still interested in doing. What he wanted to do was to do things for himself. So in 1975, he left and founded his own workshop. He calls it Bottega Workshop. He calls it Negozio, meaning it's a place for the sale of things. But usually he calls it his laboratory. Because in his laboratory, he's constantly experimenting to try to discover the technical excellence of 16th century Deruta wear. At the same time, he doesn't copy the old works, but he works like the masters in Kutahya. He works in a state of intense concentration that takes him right out of this world and into another world, where his love for the work that he does carries him. You can't make a noise loud enough to interrupt him. He just works and produces, and what he produces is also a collaboration. A collaboration because he's worked for 35 years with Maria Tomasini. He designs, that is to say, Antonio designs the plates. He paints the center, she paints the borders, and they've been working side by side for all of these years. Antonio doesn't copy old things. He doesn't continue the tradition. Instead, he tries to create new ideas that are derived from and exploit his vision of the spirit of Deruta, that is to say, a perfect technical control over what he's making, and the spirit of Italy, which he sees having reached its peak at the moment of Botticelli, very end of the 15th century, very beginning of the 16th century. He thinks that's the most beautiful moment in his art, and that's the moment from which he draws his aesthetic, his idea of perfection. At the end of a long interview that tested my Italian to its absolute limit, Antonio said, but you know what it's really all about? It's really all about passion. He said exactly the same thing that the Turkish artists do. If you ask a Turkish artisan, where does art come from? It comes from aşk, from the tremendous desire to do it right, from the tremendous desire to do it beautifully. If you ask Antonio, what is this? What does it come from? It comes from il mio passione. It comes from my powerful desire to make the best thing that I can possibly make, given who I am, a humble human being. Well, the last story will bring us right back across the Atlantic. This westward journey will end up right here in the plain old United States, in northeast Georgia, in the workshop of the Huey family. What can I tell you? It's going to be the same pattern. You're getting used to it. The Hueys have a family operation. It's based upon the close relationship of generations. This happens to be a picture that I took a dozen years ago. George was actually with me at the time, of the 50th wedding anniversary of Harold and Grace Nell Huey in Gillsville, Georgia. They're standing in the front. Grace Nell hardly looks like could be old enough to have been married for 50 years, but there it is. Behind them is their son Chester, his wife Sandra, his son Nathaniel, his son Matthew, and Matthew's wife Amanda. They're standing there. That's the type family unit that manages the production on the Huey's pottery. They do two things. They use the latest technology in a factory to produce a certain kind of ware, garden ware, that's sold everywhere, probably in Bethlehem. I live in a little town called Bloomington in Indiana. Huey's garden ware is sold in Bloomington, Indiana. It's sold in Philadelphia, I know. I know it's sold in Detroit, it's sold in Los Angeles, it's sold everywhere in the United States. Big trucks are constantly carrying the Huey's garden ware away from the Huey's factory. It's all handmade, but it's all fired in the latest with the latest equipment. They also make a different kind of ware. They make a sharp distinction between these two types. The garden ware is made for sale. It's a commercial product. It's like the normal ware of Pong, Chong, or the normal ware of Kutahya, or the normal ware of Deruta. It's the average stuff that you make because people buy it. At the very same time, they make something else. Something else that is supported economically by the fact that they make something that's saleable and inexpensive. They also make something that, in their minds, is art. It's the very word they use for it, art. They also use the word traditional for it. They also, interestingly, use the word folk for it. They don't think of the gardenware, even though it's all handmade, as being folk or traditional or art. But the words folk, traditional, and art are all applied to the great glazed ware that they made. In order to make that glazed ware, in order to make what they call art, they rely on the most old-fashioned technologies that they know. It's not because they're nostalgic, quite the reverse. What they want to use is the technologies that they're in complete control of. They don't want to be out of control, they want to be in control, they want to make something as good as they could possibly make. And you can't make something, Chester would tell you, the boss of this operation, you can't make nothing real good with a damned old machine.
Yeah.
Pretty simple. That's the idea. Native American potters think exactly the same way. You've got to make it by the hand. There's got to be the loving caress of the hand. There's got to be the touch of the human body on the material for it to actually become something like art. So you've got to throw it by hand, and here's Matthew throwing, and you've got to fire it. Fire it with fire. Fire it with wood. Dry slabs of pine. They're thrown into the old groundhog kill. You use the old-time technology, and what you create, well, you create art. That's exactly what you create. You create art because inside the old-time technology there's plenty of space to insert the self, which is the whole point of art. Here's Matthew Huey holding a pot, and think about what it means to him. It means himself because he's the one who always loved pottery. His parents say Matthew's got the blood in, the old mud in his veins. When Matthew was a little baby, his grandmother, Grace Nell, said he would just reach for clay. He wanted to hold it in his hands. He wanted to be a potter. He had it inside of him. The other people make pots. Matthew is the artist. Matthew has it in his veins. So when he holds his pot, he's holding himself, an embodiment, a materialization of his being. It's also a materialization of his line, because he, Matthew, is descendant of Chester, and Chester came from Harold, and Harold came from Bud, and Bud came from E.D., and E.D. came from old Nathaniel, and Nathaniel formed the family pottery back around 1870. So for that long time, through that sequence of masters, this has come down to Daniel, come down to Matthew. What he's interested in making is something that not only represents himself, but represents his line, and then expands beyond that to represent his community in terms of locality. What he does is he takes Georgia mud, mixes it with Georgia water, fires it with Georgia pine, and makes Georgia pots. That's exactly how he thinks about it. He also, to make it even deeper, writes John 2:16 on the bottom of every pot he makes. His pottery hasn't pictures on it like the Turkish pots or the Italian pots, but it's unquestionably art. We shouldn't be puzzled in this day, in the 21st century, but even in the 20th century, we shouldn't have been puzzled that we should necessarily require there to be imagery on something. But there's certainly art on it. The effort that Matthew has gone through to make sure that this ash glaze spills and runs and dashes, that on top of the ash glaze he's put bits of old broken medicine bottles to flow. He's creating in the kiln exactly what Jackson Pollock created on the floor in Long Island, spilling color in different directions, making design, making pattern, stepping back and allowing God to take over at the crucial moment when the firing happens. The work is, without question, art. So here's Matthew with his father, Chester. They make beautiful pots. Chester says, it ain't about pottery. Bringing up the issue of values. It ain't about pottery. What is it about, Chester? It's about community. They have, at their pottery, a festival every year called Turning and Burning Days. It's not something to which outsiders come. It's something for the local people, and they come. There's no charge, and they come. And at the very center of this operation, it being Turning and Burning Days, there's a kiln burning. And there's Matthew who's demonstrating pottery to little kids to give them some idea, maybe to welcome them into this craft. His son and daughter are already a part of it. They, of course, sell pots. Nothing wrong with a little bit of commerce. People got to make a living. But it doesn't end with pottery because it gathers also all other crafts. So there's Mr. Waldrop who makes white oak baskets. Church ladies are showing you how to make quilts. And if quilts and baskets seemed too folky, Chester Huey has a broad view that includes, for example, washing machine repair as a folk craft to be demonstrated there for the people who are interested in washing machine repair. But the center of the operation is the gospel tent. That's the energy and mind of Chester Huell and Matthew Huell and the Huell family. That's the energy that holds the thing called community together. It's held together by the word of the Lord. It's held together by an idea of the sacred. It's held together by an idea of the sacred that supports, for example, a feeling of welfare towards others. It supports the proposition of caring for people who are sick, hungry, and tired. It cares for others who follow the right path. So the main thing that people do at Turning and Burning is they don't buy pots or watch washing machine repair. They mostly sit in the gospel tent. They sing, there's a land of the unclouded sky, old rugged cross. They sing those old songs together. That's the moment they're all gathered together, and there are plenty of signs around the Turning and Burning operation that will tell you what they stand for. One of them is the old-time religion. The other, curiously, is the acceptance of the proposition of folk art. Another, obviously, is rebellion. People that are singing gospel songs and making pots out of mud are not people who self-consciously are a part of the mainstream of contemporary American society. They're clearly positioning themselves outside that mainstream and, in fact, in their minds, in a superior position. So here's Chester. He's a millionaire. Runs a big operation. He has acres and acres filled with beautiful Black Angus cattle. He's got a whole lot of money, lives in a fine brick house. But he's just so country, he even upsets his neighbors who think he's a little bit too country. But Chester knows what he's doing, and he's saying no. And he's made one time a little image of someone saying no. He made a little Confederate officer. And I asked Chester, is this a Georgia general? I mean, is this old Pete Longstreet or John B. Gordon? He said, no, it's not any of those. It's no portrait of anybody that ever lived. And I said to Chester, well, did your ancestors fight in the Civil War? He said, honestly, I haven't the slightest idea whether they fought in the Civil War. They came from Ireland, and I think they probably just hid out up here in the hills and weren't interested in that fight at all. It had nothing to do with it, probably. He said, this doesn't have anything to do with the Civil War. This is just a little rebel. Do you understand? It's just a little man saying no. Little man saying no to all that stuff you see on television. Little man saying no to all those things that you hear about in the newspapers. Just a little man who lives down here in Georgia saying no. So in the case of Chester Huell and his family, what's it about if it ain't about pottery? It's about family, and family as the heart of community. It's about community as the motive force and human dimension of locality. It's about resistance. Resistance to all these powers that seem about to swamp me and you and the Huells all together. So this is the conclusion. You wonder what's been happening. What I've been doing is showing you in a Chinese, Turkish, Italian, and American example that in all of those places the people have fundamentally the same values. Not the same values about everything in the world by any means, but the same values about what art is. And here's what art is. These are their values. These are the values that would come out of a direct empirical encounter with the people who make this stuff. Not me talking about, but what do they talk about? Here's Mrs. Sun from Pong Chong. What's Pong Chong's message? Continuity. Continuity in a time of violent change. They've had terrible violent change in the time of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution really got in the way and disturbed all of the flow of tradition. And what are the people in Pong Chong interested in doing? They're interested in keeping, in restoring, in making again, in finding excellence in the context of change, excellence that makes for continuity. The first proposition that makes for, let us call it folk art, the first proposition is a continuity in time. That is to say, the thing that we're used to calling tradition. The second value is locality. Just as there's continuity in time, there's intensity in space. Matthew Huey holding the pot that he made. He was inspired to make that pot by a pot made by a Georgia potter called Tarp Dorsey. Tarp Dorsey died in 1910. Matthew certainly never knew Tarp Dorsey, but he saw the pot. He found it beautiful. He wanted to figure out how to make glazes that broke and flowed like those that Tarp made. He wanted a form, kind of bullet-shaped form that would be absolutely and intensely local. Nobody could ever look at Matthew's pot. Even if they'd never known who Matthew was, they couldn't help but know that this was from North Georgia. This was a North Georgia pot, made out of North Georgia mud, burned with North Georgia pine. The first value in the idea of folk art is continuity in time, tradition. The second one is locality. It's families in communities, in localities with particular environments that are worth defending because you love your place. The third thing that all of these traditions have is perfectly represented by Antonio and Maria in Deruta. What they do is they take a craft, a common craft that uses cheap materials. It requires no money, it requires nothing but energy. Mud, after all, what could be easier? The clay of which Antonio's plates are just dug up right on the banks of the Tiber. The river Tiber that's heading off to Rome runs right through Deruta. Right on the banks of the river, you dig up that clay, that's the clay that you use. Use wine leaves to make the glaze. You paint it with Italian designs. It's about continuity, it's about locality, but most of all it's about taking a common craft with common materials and lifting it as high as you're capable of doing. What I would say is the next rule of folk art, continuity, locality, is excellence. To make things as good as you can conceivably make them. Given who you are, given what your circumstances are, given where you are, this is the best that you could possibly do. Continuity, locality, excellence. And the fourth, you're looking over the shoulder of Abdul Qadir Ucharolu and Kutahya. The fourth of these values, continuity in a time of change, locality in a time of globalization, excellence in a time of shoddy goods. The last is a search for the sacred in a time that's increasingly secular. It seems generally to hold these traditions together. So you look over Abdul Qadir's shoulder, and I summarize by saying that empirically understood, spending time with the artists, knowing their languages and talking with them at great length, these are the things that are constantly articulated as essential. They don't separate folk art from fine art. It's not important whether they're like the virtues of fine art or different from the virtues of fine art. What matters is these are the reasons why people are making. These are the reasons why people today, all these are recent pictures, all these are people that are all still alive. These are the people who are at work today, and their idea is an art. Call it folk if you want, or don't. I could care less, they could care less. What matters is continuity, locality, passion for excellence, and a desire for the sacred. Thank you very much.
Just two things before we open this up, and I'm sure many of you would like to ask questions, make a comment, whatever, but I forgot to say that, the highest art form the highest human art form is the art of storytelling. What we witnessed, this evening was an amazing demonstration of that art. It also, what's the power of a great storyteller? The power of a great storyteller is ashk. It communicates passion. But for all of us that were here when this took place, we all did together enter into another world. I mean, did you notice time really changed while we were listening to him? It really did change. That's a sacred power. And that brings us back to the last point. Anyway, I'm sure you all want to have it.
And Norman is just simply too nice. But as I understand about our schedule, we do have a little bit of time. And if anybody would like to ask a question or make a plea for equal time. Yes?
You mentioned that both in China and in Turkey, wars and the Cultural Revolution had decimated the ceramic trade. Did you find the same thing happening in Italy during the aftermath of the Second World War, when Italy was a battlefield?
Yes, but interestingly enough, the people in Deruta talk much more about the First World War. I mean, it's interesting because I think as Americans we think of the Second World War as being primarily a theater in Italy for the war, but they definitely today still think the First World War was much more devastating.
They fought on both sides of that one.
Huh?
They fought on both sides of that one.
Yeah. Well, it was not a comfortable time, but really it's interesting if you wanted to ask what they actually talk about, fascism. Deruta was a strong point of anti-fascism. Ubaldo Grazia, that I talked about as a potter, was a leader, a socialist leader. And so that there was a very strong socialist anti-fascist movement. And so the Second World War was very important to them. And there's actually, in the city of Perugia, a beautiful monument that the artists of Deruta made to celebrate the end of the Second World War. So I'm not suggesting by any means it wasn't important. But in the oral history of the place, the First World War was more devastating. Yes?
Hi. I'd like to echo Norman. Thank you very much for coming. I found your storytelling, the weird way you presented all this stuff, inspiring, informative, and gave me at least 3 titles for paintings, I think. Anyways, a small comment and a question. You continue to speak about what you call ash, right? Which in Yoruba culture is ashe, which is the power to make things happen, right?
Yes.
Same thing, the ability to conjure something out of
Absolutely.
nothing, mud into form, boost your imagination, bottle caps into a transformative object, which is really
Absolutely.
great to see that. Which brought me to a point which I guess maybe I was about 5 minutes late to the beginning of this. I don't know if you covered it, but I was a little bit thrown off in the absence of artifacts and cultural things and cultural craft from people of African origin, and I found that very strange, especially in light of the fact of the Huey family, is it? The Huey family that you showed,
Yeah.
and their more private ceramic pottery, which were face jugs, which were such an integral part of the presence of Africans in this country, especially in places like Georgia and South Carolina, where there were massive trades of African slave pottery and face jugs, and that was such a significant part of the history and culture of people of African descent in this culture. To see them doing those was sort of shocking. Did they talk in any way about how they came to do those, or where they came from? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a circle around the world, it's going to leave out a lot of stuff. But I'd like to capture your first thought to comment on it, because I don't know whether Ashe and Ashk are the same, but my suspicion is that they probably are. You may know that I wrote a long book about Twin 77, and so I've written a whole book about Yoruba art. And in that book, I was just very interested in the way in which people say, you know, ashe is used very much like amen in a prayer. Just like Southern folks would say amen, they say ashe, ashe. And to hear it all the time, and ashe is thought to be generally something created in the other world, in Orun, and it comes into, it sort of seeps into our universe, and we try to get a hold of it.
Those artists, we bring it in.
Yeah, we try to bring it in and use it.
Right.
And so that someone like my friend Twins or Mr. I of course knew him quite well too, use that power. It's very like ash. I just don't know whether etymologically we have a connection, but nonetheless I think that it's really an interesting possibility. At least I would say more profoundly, because I don't think there's any etymological connection between passione and ash. It's just the word that we're going to use for going into an altered state in our ability to create. The direct question you ask is about the Huels and face jugs. You're exactly right. The reason I didn't emphasize it is because I was getting a little story done quickly. And also I have different thoughts fighting for dominance in my mind at this time, so I'm going to tell you two. The first one is, what is the face jug according to the Huels? It was invented by African Americans, without question. In their mind, invented by African Americans in South Carolina. Not only invented by African Americans in South Carolina, they know the route that it got to them. They're actually quite aware of it. That is to say, a potter named Ferguson went into near the Landrum's plantation in South Carolina, Edgefield district of South Carolina, saw African American face jugs, saw them there, came back and was amazed and made one. He taught a friend of his whose name was Huey. He was actually an uncle, a great uncle of Chester's. He taught that man taught Cheever Metters. Cheever Metters taught Lanier Metters. Lanier Metters taught Chester Huey. When Chester was just a young, starting out in pottery, he'd always made utilitarian pottery. He'd never made a face jug. And he thought that he had the right to learn from Lanier, so he went up. Lanier Metters is just, Mossy Creek is, 40 miles north of where Chester lives. So he went up to Mossy Creek and he said to Lanier, "You got to show me how to make a face jug." And Lanier said, "This is my secret. I learned it from my daddy." And Chester said, "Yeah, but your daddy learned from my uncle." I mean, it's tight, so that there's a kind of general historical story about the face jug coming from African Americans, but from the Huels, it's not general, it's very specific. Invented by African American people, no question. Learned by Ferguson to Huel, Huel to Metters to Metters to Huel. That's the way the tradition got into the world. So you very often think about the face jug as being sort of a broad Southern tradition. It's very, very specific.
Often the last artifact they found on the slave groups, they would throw away everything before they threw away the face jug. It would be the last object the slave would discard before he or she got to the last part of the journey.
Yeah.
Is that sacred?
Yeah, so the interesting thing from that standpoint about the Huels is they are obviously white people. Everybody who's today making those things at a tradition are white people. Basically, if you think about it, I think the best thing to think about is the banjo. Almost a symbol of white culture. It's an African instrument. The banjo, the word is the West African word. So that Thomas Jefferson called it the noble Negro instrument. Seem to have lost that. But the important thing is so many really wonderful African traditions are now in the hands of white people, and that's just what's happened. It's interesting to report that the Huels, Fergusons, and all these people were not themselves anything like slaveholders. In fact, there are very few African Americans in that part of Georgia. It's hilly. And so they understood it, so they didn't have, I'm not saying they weren't vexed, but they didn't have any problem at all thinking it was just fine for them to borrow an African American tradition, and because it was African American, they carried on. There is a second slight story about this, though, is that when the current revival of Southern pottery began, it began with a particular Ralph Rensler, who went from the Smithsonian Institution down to North Georgia, who met Cheever Metters, and when Ralph met Cheever Metters had made 4 face jugs. Lanier, his son, saw that this Yankee liked face jugs. Lanier started making face jugs hand over fist. And he was so successful that Berlin Craig in North Carolina started making face jugs. And so that the whole face jug enterprise in the mind of the Metterses and Mr. Craig was commercial.
But what was amazing when you showed that image that the Huey elder had made of the soldier, Confederate soldier in the army, that was the irony of seeing a black face jug features on a Confederate soldier with almost cartoony, roundish black. I couldn't, my brain was like exploding.
That's right.
It's just, I couldn't like understand what I was looking at. And to hear you to talk about the story was, which is I think what makes this country wonderful. It was so fascinating because we overlap these things in ways that don't have to do with race, but they come from race. And what was so striking about the face jug wasn't the idea that white people were making it, was how little had been lost aesthetically in translation. That's what was really amazing.
That's right. Because the key there is the mixing of media. And that's been absolutely consistent, because face jugs are made all over the world. I mean, I hope people understand.
Sure.
But face jugs with eyes made of stone or porcelain, teeth made of broken china, that's just Mr. Landrum's enslaved people in captivity to Ferguson, to Huey, to Metters, back to Huey.
Thanks.
Tiny illustration. But the thing about Chester is that it's important to know, he knows that, no problem for him to put that head on his Confederate guy. Because his Confederate guy's not a Confederate guy. He's a Georgia guy. His Georgia is filled with African American people. His craft, I mean, if I he always invites African American women from South Carolina, from Charleston, who come to his turning and burning and make their baskets. One of the absolute African traditions in North America. But the other thing I would say is that the face jugs became so involved in the minds of the Metterses and Hueys and Craigs with commerce that they today have sort of lost interest in. They got so wrapped up in, so that Matthew, as the next generation, makes face jugs, but he doesn't really like them. Got nothing to do with the race issue. It has to do with basically face jugs meant kind of folklorismus. And folklorismus was a way in which you could sell your craft to these Yankees. And so that to some extent the next generation, there's a resistance. It's interesting, kind of resistance against face jugs, having nothing to do with their African origin, but having to do with the fact that they were so wrapped up in the way that we were, this is the way the young guys are thinking, that we were slightly demeaning ourselves to appeal to these outside white people. And so what we really do, because what they call face jugs, they call them ugly jugs. And so what they want to do, what Matthew wants to make, beautiful jugs. It's interesting. So there's a double dimension. One of them is absolutely proud connection in locality to the African origin, to the pot. The second one is a little bit of diffidence because that pot became so wrapped up in a merely commercial enterprise in the 70s and 80s that there are a lot of people today who are a little bit, the next generation is sort of tired of it. And yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, no. This is wonderful. I mean, obviously we can go on and on. Let's say one last short question.
I don't
Talk
want
too much, but that's a great topic. Yeah.
As a folk artist at 104, Beatrice Wood, I don't know if you are familiar with her, from Lehigh, California, who was quite a ceramist, had an exhibition at the American Craft Museum. But her big thrust was folk art and her glazes, which she was able to create with a special formula. But at any rate, I became very interested in her, and she died at 104 about 4 years ago. But she was very, she wasn't religious in a sense. Her big, I could go on, and I have a book about her. And I have one of her bowls with this very wonderful glaze.
Yeah.
But she was definitely a folk artist and did very silly figures. But it's another topic. I won't go on and on.
The current generation of these potters, glazers, is what interests them. And the kind of concern about the silliness is maybe what doesn't make them happy.
Which doesn't what?
Make the sort of the next generation is sort of a little bit tired of silliness.
Well, it had some tradition with it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, she was part of the God.
Mhm.
Well, excuse me.
Sorry. No.
Well, listen, all I want to say to you all is, clearly this was a very special evening for all of us. It makes me think we indeed must make a pact, now, all of us. We will have Henry Glassie back, and we will do, my colleagues right here who can make it happen, we will do the definitive face junk show.
Oh, yeah, where's my friend? He just-
But listen, let's thank Henry Glassie very much. We've got food back there.